I am Ethan, 28 years old. 10 years ago, on the exact evening of my 18th birthday, my family completely replaced me with a brand new Porsche. While I was standing in the foyer of our home, dripping wet from the rain and holding a piece of half-eaten grocery store cake, my own mother looked me dead in the eyes and handed me a card that said I needed to be more like my younger brother. They laughed at me in front of 30 people. But there is one thing they absolutely did not know. The immense wealth they were flaunting, the very ground they walked on and the pristine walls that housed their perfect suburban lives, was about to legally belong to me. And now they are the ones begging for a roof over their heads. Before I tell you exactly what happened and how I dismantled their lives, hit that like button if you believe in true, unfiltered justice. And don't forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Now let's go back to where this nightmare began. I grew up in a neighborhood where the lawns were perfectly manicured by hired landscapers every Tuesday, and the dark family secrets were buried deep under expensive azalea bushes. On the outside, my family represented the absolute pinnacle of the American dream. We lived in a sprawling, two-story colonial house with white pillars and a circular driveway. My father, Richard, was a man who cared infinitely more about his golf handicap and his elected position on the Homeowners Association board than he ever cared about his sons. He was a junior executive at a logistics firm, but he spent money like he owned the company. My mother, Margaret, was a terrifying master of appearances. She baked artisanal pies for the neighborhood charity bake sales and hosted lavish Thanksgiving dinners that looked like they belonged in a magazine, all while running a quiet, psychological dictatorship behind closed doors. And then there was Julian, my younger brother by exactly 2 years. Julian was the undeniable golden child, the sun around which my parents' entire universe revolved. The dynamic was established early and enforced ruthlessly. If Julian sneezed, my parents practically bought him a new video game console to make him feel better. If Julian failed a math test, it was the teacher's fault for being incompetent, and they would hire a private tutor at $50 an hour to coddle him through the next exam. Meanwhile, if I brought home a straight-A report card, my father would barely glance over the top of his financial newspaper, sip his scotch, and tell me not to get a big head about it because a high salary requires actual hard work, not just book smarts. The favoritism was not subtle. It was woven into the very fabric of our daily existence, a constant, suffocating weight. Julian got the massive master bedroom down the hall with the walk-in closet and the private ensuite bathroom. I was relegated to the cramped guest room near the attic that always smelled faintly of dust and old mothballs, with a window that rattled every time the wind blew. They never explicitly sat me down and said they loved him more, but their actions screamed it louder than a tornado siren. When Julian crashed my father's sedan into a mailbox at 16 because he was texting, they hugged him, told him cars could be replaced, and bought him a newer model 6 months later. When I asked for a meager college fund contribution to buy a used laptop for my senior year, my father handed me a printed-out list of local fast food restaurants hiring teenagers. I learned to survive by becoming invisible. I was background noise. I was the quiet, observant kid who finished his homework early, ironed his own clothes, and stayed out of the way just so no one would find a reason to scream at me. I fed myself little lies to make the bitter reality easier to swallow. I told myself they were harder on me because they expected more. I told myself it was building character. But the mask permanently shattered on my 18th birthday. It was a miserable, gray Thursday. The rain was coming down in freezing sheets. I had just taken a brutal calculus exam that morning, and I was physically and emotionally exhausted. I walked the 2 miles home from the bus stop without an umbrella because Julian had taken mine that morning and left it in a friend's car. My clothes were soaked through to my skin. I was not expecting a parade. I was not expecting a marching band or a grand declaration of love. I just wanted a quiet dinner, maybe a decent steak, and a simple acknowledgement that I was officially an adult. I walked up the driveway, noticing an unusual number of cars parked along the street, but I figured my mother was hosting one of her impromptu committee meetings. I walked through the heavy oak front door, shrugging off my soaking wet jacket, and the lights suddenly flipped on with a blinding flash. A crowd of about 30 people, neighbors, extended family, my parents' country club friends, and even Julian's high school baseball coach, stood packed into our living room. Silver and blue balloons were tied to the banister. A massive, professionally printed banner hung across the brick fireplace. It did not say Happy 18th Ethan. It just said Happy Birthday. And standing right in the middle of the room, wearing a smug, practiced grin that I will never forget, was Julian. His birthday was not for another 3 full weeks. My mother rushed forward, completely brushing past my shivering frame, holding her smartphone up to record the spectacle. She went straight to Julian. My father stepped up next to him, his chest puffed out with pride, holding a small velvet jewelry box. He opened it slowly to reveal a shiny set of keys with a distinct crest. A brand new Porsche, a literal luxury sports car for a 16-year-old kid who had a history of reckless driving. The crowd erupted into wild applause. Julian pumped his fist in the air, shouting his excitement, soaking up the adoration. I just stood there in the tiled entryway, water dripping from my hair into my eyes, my heavy backpack still slung over one shoulder. I watched my entire family buzz around the room like it was Christmas morning. I waited for the punchline. I waited for anyone, to turn around and say they were kidding, that my real gift was waiting in the kitchen, that they remembered the son who was actually crossing the threshold into adulthood that day. Cleared my throat. My voice cracked slightly as I spoke. I asked if anyone realized it was actually my birthday today. The room went dead silent. The kind of profound, agonizing silence that rings in your ears and makes your stomach plummet. Everyone froze just for a beat, exchanging uncomfortable glances. My mother turned to me. Her smile did not reach her cold eyes. She let out a high-pitched, incredibly forced laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. She told the crowd that, of course, they did not forget their other son. She walked over to the granite kitchen counter and picked up a flimsy paper plate. On it was a single slice of cheap, grocery store sheet cake. Half of it was missing, the cheap blue frosting smeared across the cardboard. There were no candles. There was no name written on it. She walked over and shoved it into my hands along with a sealed white envelope. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. There was no cash inside. There was no heartfelt message about me becoming a man or taking on the world. There was just a generic dollar store card, and in my mother's flawless, looping cursive handwriting, 5 devastating words were written right in the center. Be more like your brother. Sarah, my mother's closest friend and the most vicious gossip in our zip code, let out a loud, distinct snicker from near the sofa. Soon, a few others chuckled nervously. They thought it was a joke. They thought it was hilarious, edgy family banter. I looked at my father. He was completely ignoring the situation, busy showing Julian the intricate leather interior details of the car from a glossy dealership brochure. I looked at my mother. She had already turned her back to me, her phone pointed at Julian again, demanding he stand by the window so she could get the lighting right for social media. I did not scream. I did not throw the pathetic piece of cake at the wall. I did not demand an explanation. Something inside me, some vital cord of hope I had been clinging to for 18 years, simply snapped. I quietly placed the paper plate on the entryway table next to a vase of fresh lilies. I walked up the stairs to my cramped room. I pulled a faded duffel bag from under my bed. I methodically packed 3 pairs of jeans, a few heavy shirts, clean socks, my phone charger, and the emergency $40 I had stashed in a shoebox from mowing lawns all summer. I waited until the party moved out to the driveway to admire the new car in the rain. Then, I walked down the back stairs, slipped out the kitchen door, hopped the wooden fence, and walked 3 miles in the freezing downpour to the Greyhound station under the amber glow of flickering streetlights. I bought a one-way ticket to the city. I sat in the back of the bus, shivering in my damp clothes, watching the suburban houses fade into the darkness. A week later, sitting on a stained, lumpy mattress in a cheap motel that smelled of stale smoke and bleach, my cracked phone buzzed. It was a voicemail from my mother. Her voice was trembling, thick with heavy, dramatic tears. She begged me to come home. She said they did not know it would hurt me so much, that it was just a terrible misunderstanding, that they were planning a separate dinner for me all along, and that my father was driving around everywhere worried sick. It was a masterful, Oscar-worthy performance. If I had not lived with her for 18 grueling years, I might have actually believed it. But I knew the truth. She was not crying because she missed her eldest son. She was crying because her perfect, carefully curated family image had a massive crack in it, and the nosy neighbors were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about why Ethan was no longer mowing the lawn. I deleted the voicemail without listening to the end. I turned off my phone, wrapped myself in a thin blanket, and prepared for war. The city does not care if you are hurting. It does not care if your heart is broken, if you are terrified, or if you just got betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect and nurture you. The city is a massive, grinding machine, and it only demands one thing: rent. Those first few years on my own were a brutal, relentless masterclass in sheer survival. I found a bed in a rundown youth hostel for $50 a week, sharing a cramped room with men who sold knockoff sunglasses and avoided eye contact. I worked construction during the day, breathing in toxic drywall dust, hauling heavy bags of cement up 5 flights of stairs until my shoulders felt like they were going to separate from my body and my hands were blistered and bleeding. At night, I washed greasy dishes in a 24-hour diner where the hot water scalded my forearms, and my clothes permanently smelled like old French fries and burnt coffee. I eventually upgraded to a roach-infested apartment the size of a walk-in closet in a neighborhood where sirens were the nightly lullaby. I ate generic canned beans, instant noodles, and day-old bread. But every single time my back ached so badly I wanted to collapse, or my stomach growled so loud it kept me awake, I thought about that half-eaten cake. I thought about the gleam of that new Porsche, and it fueled me with a dark, burning energy. I absolutely refused to be the tragic failure they expected me to become. I refused to let their narrative be my reality. I started spending every free hour at the massive public downtown library after my exhausting diner shifts. I read everything I could possibly get my hands on about commercial business, macrofinance, and real estate development. I wanted to deeply understand how money moved, how true power was built, and how people like my father managed to keep it while contributing nothing of real value. I started taking cheap online courses at a local community college, sitting at library computers until closing time, paying for the credits out of pocket, dollar by agonizing dollar. The only person from my past who ever reached out to me with genuine concern was Aunt Clara. She was my mother's older sister, but they were complete opposites. Clara was loud, unfiltered, and fiercely independent. She was the designated black sheep of the family simply because she refused to play the ridiculous country club status game. Clara finally found me 3 brutal years after I had left. She tracked me down through an old tax record I had filed when I got a slightly better job at a hardware store. She walked into the diner one rainy Tuesday evening, sat at the cracked vinyl counter, and ordered a black coffee. When I turned around from the grill to hand it to her, I nearly dropped the ceramic mug. She looked older, her face lined with worry. She did not hug me right away. She just looked at my calloused hands, the dark circles under my tired eyes, the cheap uniform, and nodded slowly. She told me I looked like a man who was fighting a long, silent war. We sat in a booth in the back, away from the other customers, and that was when she told me exactly what my family had been up to since the night I vanished. They had not been mourning my absence. They had not been searching the streets. They had been aggressively rewriting history to protect themselves. My mother had told the entire neighborhood, our extended family, and everyone at her weekly church group that I had fallen in with a dangerous, bad crowd. She fabricated a story that I had developed a severe, uncontrollable drug addiction and had violently stolen money from my father's college fund account before running away into the night. She painted herself as the tragic, heartbroken, long-suffering mother of a lost, criminal addict. She gathered their sympathy like currency, soaking up their casseroles and pitying looks. My father used my absence to justify permanently pulling the plug on any financial support he might have been socially expected to provide for my education, claiming to his golf buddies that it was necessary tough love. Hearing those lies did not break my heart. It hardened it into steel. It confirmed everything I already knew about their toxic nature. Clara slid a thick, unmarked envelope across the sticky table. Inside was a small stack of crisp cash and a slightly used, but functional laptop. She told me it was absolutely not charity, it was an investment. She said she had always seen through their garbage, and she believed in me. That laptop literally changed the trajectory of my life. It allowed me to dig much deeper into the commercial real estate market from my tiny apartment, to start building a proper resume, and to finally apply for entry-level administrative jobs in corporate firms instead of breaking my back on construction sites. A year later, at 22, my relentless studying paid off. I finally landed a junior analyst interview at a prestigious commercial real estate firm in the financial district. I bought a cheap suit from a thrift store, tailored it myself, and nailed the interview. I was ecstatic. But when the firm ran a standard background and credit check as part of the onboarding process, I hit a massive brick wall that nearly destroyed my entire existence. The HR manager called me into her pristine glass office, looking deeply concerned and slightly suspicious. She told me they could not finalize the hiring process. My credit score was not just bad. It was catastrophic. I was flagged for massive amounts of bad debt, severe defaults, and active collections. I was completely stunned. I felt like the floor had vanished. I had never owned a single credit card. I paid for my rent, my food, and my clothes strictly in cash. I marched straight down to a major bank branch on my lunch break and sat down with a senior loan officer named Mr. Sterling. I begged him to help me pull my full, detailed credit report. He printed out the thick stack of papers, his brow furrowed, and slid them across the heavy mahogany desk. I stared at the black numbers in absolute disbelief. There were multiple auto loans. There were high-interest personal loans. There were platinum credit cards maxed out at luxury department stores. The total debt was staggering. It was well over $150,000. I looked at Mr. Sterling, my hands shaking violently, and asked how this was legally possible when I was living in a slum and eating beans. He pointed a thick finger to a specific massive auto loan that had gone into severe default years ago. The origination date was exactly 1 week before my 18th birthday. The vehicle attached to the loan was a high-performance Porsche. The room started to spin violently. The air was entirely sucked out of my lungs. My parents had not just bought Julian a luxury car to spite me. They had used my name, my date of birth, and my social security number to finance it. They had stolen my identity while I was still a minor living under their roof, forged my signature on legal financial documents, and saddled me with a mountain of toxic debt to fund their golden child's extravagant lifestyle. And when I ran away, they simply stopped making the expensive monthly payments, letting the massive debt default and completely destroying my financial future before it even had a chance to begin. They did not just replace me with a car. They sacrificed my entire life to the wolves so they could keep up appearances at the country club. I walked out of that bank branch with a cold, terrifying clarity that I had never experienced before. I did not cry. I did not feel sad or overwhelmed. I felt a deep, dark, calculating rage settling permanently into my bones. This was no longer just about a bad childhood or emotional neglect. This was absolute financial ruin. This was a calculated felony. I spent the next 5 grueling years cleaning up their radioactive mess. I worked closely with Mr. Sterling, who took pity on my situation, and a fierce, young lawyer who took my identity theft case pro bono because she hated financial predators. We filed massive police reports, submitted endless affidavits of fraud, and fought the massive credit bureaus tooth and nail. It was an exhausting, humiliating process, constantly having to prove that I was not the one who bought a luxury sports car and maxed out Neiman Marcus cards while washing dishes for minimum wage. Slowly, agonizingly, we cleared my name. The debts were legally removed from my file, but the criminal investigation into my parents was severely stalled because the statute of limitations and the extreme complexities of familial fraud made it a bureaucratic nightmare for the local prosecutor. I told the lawyer to permanently pause the criminal pursuit. I had a much better idea. Prison was far too easy for people who cared only about their social standing and their wealth. Putting them behind bars would just allow my mother to play the victim of an unjust legal system. I wanted to take the one thing they actually loved, their empire. By the time I turned 27, I was an entirely different person. I no longer wore concrete-stained jeans. I wore custom-tailored Italian suits. I had aggressively clawed my way up the corporate ladder at one of the top commercial real estate development firms in the city. I was sharp, relentless, and I never, ever let emotion cloud my professional judgment. My mentor, the CEO of the firm, a terrifyingly brilliant man named Marcus, saw a raw hunger in me that he deeply respected. Marcus was a shark, a self-made billionaire who demanded absolute excellence and heavily rewarded fierce loyalty. Under his strict guidance, I was personally closing multimillion-dollar commercial deals and was directly in line for a massive promotion to senior partner. My life was finally secure and stable. I had a beautiful luxury apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. I had a substantial six-figure salary, a maxed-out 401k, and a formidable reputation in the industry as a closer. I also had Chloe. Chloe was a high-end art gallery curator, elegant, sophisticated, and exactly the kind of woman I thought I needed to complete the picture of my new, successful life. We had been dating seriously for 2 years. I trusted her implicitly. In a moment of vulnerability, I told her everything about my dark past, about the horrific birthday, the massive identity theft, the years of struggle. She held my hand tightly, kissed my forehead, and swore she would never let anyone hurt me again. But the past has a uniquely cruel way of finding you when you least expect it, usually when you finally feel safe. It started on a Tuesday morning with a thick, certified legal envelope delivered directly to my office by a courier. I sliced it open with a silver letter opener. Inside was a formal notification regarding the estate of my late paternal grandfather. He had recently passed away, and according to the dense legal documents, a massive trust fund inheritance was set to be disbursed to the surviving family. But there was a massive, insurmountable catch for my parents. The trust was structured rigidly by a paranoid old man. It required the physically notarized signatures of every single living biological heir to release the funds. If even one heir contested or refused to sign the release, the entire multimillion-dollar trust would be frozen in hostile probate court for years, tying up the money indefinitely. My toxic family needed me, not as a beloved son, not as a missing brother. They desperately needed my legal signature. The aggressive harassment began almost immediately. My personal cell phone, which I had changed 3 times over the years, started ringing incessantly with blocked numbers. Demanding emails flooded my secure work inbox. They were all from my father's expensive attorney, demanding an immediate meeting to discuss the inheritance. I ignored every single one of them. I instructed my receptionist and building security to permanently block any visitors claiming to be my family. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of a single word of response. But Margaret and Richard were incredibly desperate. The lavish country club lifestyle they stubbornly maintained was built on a crumbling house of cards. Through my own extensive real estate connections and industry software, I had quietly run deep background checks on their assets. They were bleeding money at an alarming rate. The logistics business my father ran was failing spectacularly due to mismanagement. To cover their tracks and their lifestyle, they had taken out a massive, high-interest second mortgage on their sprawling estate, and the devastating balloon payment was coming due in mere months. If they did not get their hands on that inheritance money soon, they were going to lose the house to the bank. They were going to lose their elite status. They were going to be publicly ruined. Since they could not reach me directly, they made a calculated, evil decision. They decided to completely destroy the new life I had built in order to force me to the negotiating table. I was deeply immersed in working on the absolute biggest deal of my entire career. It was a massive commercial acquisition of a prime downtown city block that would definitively secure my promotion to senior partner. I had spent 6 grueling months negotiating the complex terms, securing the zoning, and organizing the capital. Everything was strictly confidential. Only Marcus, my immediate legal team, and Chloe knew the intricate details of the bid. 3 days before the final closing, the entire deal violently blew up in my face. A rival development firm miraculously swooped in at the 11th hour and outbid us by exactly $50,000. It was a flawless surgical strike. They knew our exact financial ceiling. They knew our complex financing structure. Someone on the inside had deliberately leaked our entire playbook. Marcus called me into his expansive corner office. He was furious, the veins standing out on his neck. He did not explicitly accuse me of incompetence, but he demanded to know exactly how our highly secure data had been compromised. My bitter colleague, Derek, a snake in a tailored suit who had been aggressively gunning for the exact same promotion, looked extremely pleased with himself during the emergency staff meeting. I spent 48 frantic hours tearing through my own life, trying to find the leak. I checked my secure devices, the server logs, everything. Then, I came home early one evening, exhausted and defeated. Chloe was in the master bedroom, talking on her cell phone. The door was slightly ajar. Her voice was hushed, frantic, and filled with panic. I stood perfectly still in the carpeted hallway, my heart pounding in my throat. "I did exactly what you asked, Margaret," Chloe hissed desperately into the phone. "I got Derek the secure files. The deal is completely dead. But Ethan isn't breaking down. He's not packing up his things to go back to you. You promised me the rest of the money once he was officially fired." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. Margaret, my mother. I did not kick the bedroom door down. I did not yell or scream. I walked backward, silently, out of the apartment. I went down to the underground parking garage and sat in the driver's seat of my car. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white and my hands cramped. My own mother. She had somehow tracked down my girlfriend, discovered that Chloe was secretly drowning in massive credit card debt to keep up her glamorous art world lifestyle, and simply bought her off. My mother had ruthlessly orchestrated a corporate espionage plot with my rival Derek just to get me fired, hoping that if I lost my job, my apartment, and my reputation, I would be forced to come crawling back home and sign those inheritance papers out of sheer financial desperation. They were willing to completely destroy my entire existence, my career, and my heart, just for a signature on a piece of paper. I pulled out my phone and immediately called Detective Vance, the relentless private investigator I had used during my identity theft case years ago. I told him I needed him to drop everything and pull every single financial record, every wire transfer, and every bank statement connected to Chloe and Derek for the last 3 months. I wanted absolute, undeniable proof. The next morning, I walked into my apartment. Chloe was making coffee in the kitchen, smiling brightly at me as if she had not just sold my soul for a wire transfer. I dropped a heavy manila folder onto the marble kitchen island. Inside were the highlighted bank statements Vance had pulled overnight. There was a glaring $50,000 transfer from an obscure offshore account directly linked to my father's holding company, deposited straight into Chloe's personal checking account. She went dead pale. She dropped the coffee spoon. She tried to stammer out a pathetic excuse, fake tears welling up in her eyes, claiming she was desperate. I did not raise my voice. I looked at her with absolute dead eyes and told her she had exactly 1 hour to pack her things and get out of my apartment, or I was immediately handing the folder over to the police for corporate espionage, theft, and extortion. She was gone in 45 minutes, leaving her keys on the counter. I took the exact same folder straight to Marcus. I laid the damning evidence out on his heavy oak desk. I showed him the wire transfer to Derek. I told him the entire ugly story. The identity theft, the grandfather's inheritance, the family debt, the sabotage. I did not ask for pity. I asked for permission to crush them all. Marcus looked at the documents, tapping his pen. Then he looked at me. A slow, incredibly dangerous smile spread across his weathered face. He fired Derek before lunch, having security escort him out of the building, ensuring the man would face a lawsuit and never work in commercial real estate in this city again. Then, Marcus poured us both a generous glass of expensive, aged scotch. He told me the senior partner promotion was officially mine, and he told me that if I wanted to systematically dismantle my father's empire, he would give me full access to the firm's massive private acquisition capital to do it right. I did not want to just take their inheritance money. Refusing to sign the papers was too passive. I wanted to actively take their pride, their status, and the very foundation they stood on. The inheritance trust was merely a distraction, a temporary lifeline they were reaching for. Their real, fatal vulnerability was their beloved estate. The massive, sprawling property in the exclusive gated community that my mother treated like a royal palace. It was the absolute epicenter of their social power and their entire identity. Through my continued investigations, I discovered a critical piece of information. The second mortgage they had recklessly taken out was not held by a traditional bank. It was held by a private, highly aggressive lending firm that specialized in distressed assets. Because my father had been quietly missing his massive monthly payments, the loan was currently classified internally as highly toxic debt. I used my new, substantial promotion salary, my massive executive bonuses, and the overwhelming financial backing of Marcus's capital fund to make a quiet, devastatingly brilliant corporate maneuver. I established a blind LLC, completely untraceable to my name. Through my team of ruthless corporate lawyers, I approached the lending firm holding my parents' mortgage. They were absolutely thrilled to offload the toxic debt off their books. I bought the paper at a premium, paying cash. In a matter of weeks, without a single public record or whisper linking my name to the transaction, my blind LLC became the sole owner of my parents' massive debt. I legally held the deed to their house. I held the absolute power to foreclose on them the very second they missed another payment, which I knew was imminent. And they had absolutely no idea the sword hanging over their heads was held by the son they threw away. While I was meticulously laying these financial traps and preparing the legal paperwork, I received an unexpected email. It was sent to my secure personal address from an encrypted burner account. The subject line just said, "Read this." I opened it. It was from Julian. He wrote a long, frantic message detailing that our parents were planning a massive, extensively catered event at the country club to celebrate their 30th wedding anniversary next month. They were inviting the local mayor, several city judges, and every single elite member of their snobbish social circle. And then Julian revealed their ultimate master plan. They were going to use the anniversary party to publicly stage a grand, emotional reconciliation. They were going to announce to the world that I, the prodigal, troubled, drug-addicted son, was finally returning home. They had actually hired a high-priced PR firm to carefully spin the story. They needed me there to play the part of the grateful, repentant child, to smile for the flashing cameras, and then to quietly sign the inheritance papers in the back room so they could access the trust fund and save their sinking ship. Julian attached a scanned copy of the exclusive guest list and the minute-by-minute schedule of events. At the very end of the email, he wrote a single, chilling line. "They think you are stupid. Burn them down." I sat back in my leather office chair and stared at the glowing screen for a long time. The golden child, the brother who had gleefully driven the Porsche bought with my stolen identity, the one who had always benefited from my misery, was handing me the matches. I didn't entirely know his true angle yet, whether it was guilt, spite, or self-preservation, but I knew a golden opportunity when I saw one. I immediately called Mr. Sterling at the bank and Detective Vance. I told them to definitively finalize the foreclosure notices based on the missed payments. I had the damning documents printed on heavy, watermarked legal paper. I placed them carefully in a sleek, black leather briefcase. I went to a high-end tailor and bought a bespoke Tom Ford suit that cost more than my parents' annual country club membership dues. I made sure every detail was perfect, from the silk tie to the polished Italian shoes. I was not going to hide in the shadows anymore. I was not going to be the silent victim in their manufactured tragedy. They wanted a massive public spectacle. They wanted a captive audience of the city's elite to witness their grand, fake forgiveness. They wanted to parade me around like a conquered prize. I was going to give them a show they would never, ever forget. The night of the highly anticipated anniversary party, a severe, rolling thunderstorm moved into the city. Lightning cracked violently across the dark sky, illuminating the heavy raindrops streaking down the tinted windows of the luxury town car I had hired to drive me to the sprawling country club. I sat perfectly still in the back seat, the black briefcase resting heavily on my lap. I traced the smooth leather handle with my thumb. My heart was beating a steady, incredibly calm rhythm. There was no fear left in me. There was no anxiety. There was only the icy, unwavering resolve of a man who had spent 10 grueling years walking barefoot through hell, finally arriving at the gilded gates to collect his due. The storm was raging outside the car windows, but the real hurricane was about to walk right through their front doors. The heavy, dark oak doors of the Oakmont Country Club loomed ahead of me like the impenetrable gates of a fortified castle I was finally fully equipped to breach. The violent thunderstorm outside was raging with an almost cinematic intensity, the jagged lightning violently illuminating the meticulously manicured 18-hole golf course that my father valued far more than his own flesh and blood. But inside the grand, sprawling foyer, it was an entirely different universe. It was a perfectly insulated world of hushed wealth, clinking crystal champagne flutes, and thick, imported Persian carpets that were designed to swallow the sound of approaching footsteps and uncomfortable truths alike. I handed my dripping black umbrella to a young, wide-eyed valet, who looked entirely too intimidated by the sharp, ruthless cut of my bespoke Tom Ford suit. I took a moment to adjust my pristine French cuffs, allowing the heavy gold links to gleam under the massive, cascading crystal chandelier above me. I took a slow, deep, calculated breath. The sleek leather briefcase tightly gripped in my right hand felt like a physical anchor, grounding me in the absolute, undeniable reality of what I was about to execute. 10 years ago, I had walked out into a freezing rainstorm wearing cheap jeans and carrying $40. Tonight, I was walking out of the rain carrying the absolute destruction of my abusers. As I walked down the long, portrait-lined mahogany corridor toward the grand ballroom, the muffled sounds of a live string quartet drifted through the air. Suddenly, a young woman with a frantic expression, a headset, and a glowing tablet practically sprinted up to me, her high heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. She was the aggressive PR coordinator Julian had explicitly warned me about in his email. She had been hired specifically by my mother to carefully choreograph and spin my grand, deeply humiliating return to the family fold. "Ethan? Oh, thank goodness you are finally here," she breathed out in a rush, her eyes darting nervously over my expensive suit and completely unbothered demeanor. She was clearly shocked that the supposedly destitute, drug-addicted runaway described by her clients looked like a man who could buy the entire country club in a single cash transaction. "Your mother was getting incredibly anxious. We are on a very tight schedule tonight. Okay. Please listen carefully, here is the exact run of show. When Richard takes the stage for the anniversary toast in 20 minutes, he is going to talk at length about family resilience and the painful journey of healing. When he distinctly says the word homecoming, that is your absolute cue. We need you to walk slowly up the center aisle, look incredibly overwhelmed with emotion, and embrace him on the stage. The lead photographer from the local society pages will be positioned right by the swan ice sculpture to capture the reunion. We really need tears, Ethan. The narrative depends on it. Can you give us genuine tears?" I looked down at her glowing tablet, and then up at her panicked face. My expression remained completely flat, utterly devoid of any warmth, compliance, or fear. "I will give them exactly what they have earned," I said quietly, my voice smooth and low, carrying a dangerous edge that made the PR coordinator physically take a step back. I walked right past her, ignoring her desperate stammering in the hallway, and pushed open the incredibly heavy double doors leading directly into the main ballroom. The sheer, unrestrained opulence of the room was practically nauseating in its excess. Thousands of imported white roses cascaded elegantly from towering silver vases placed on every single table. Waiters wearing crisp, immaculate white tuxedos and white gloves circulated silently through the crowd, offering silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and expensive beluga caviar. And there, holding court near the absolute center of the room, bathing in the adoration of their peers, were Margaret and Richard, my parents. They were completely surrounded by the absolute elite of the city's power structure. I instantly recognized Mayor Henderson, 2 prominent district court judges, and several incredibly wealthy commercial real estate developers I had frequently encountered at high-level industry galas. My father was holding a crystal glass of very aged scotch, laughing heartily and loudly at a joke I am entirely certain was not actually funny. My mother was clinging tightly to his arm, wearing a blindingly bright diamond necklace that I knew, courtesy of my private investigator, was currently heavily leveraged against their rapidly failing logistics business. The exact moment I stepped off the carpeted entryway and onto the polished hardwood floor of the ballroom, the entire dynamic of the room shifted. It was a subtle but undeniable ripple. People stopped mid-sentence. Eyes turned sharply toward me. The hushed whispers started instantly, rustling through the heavily perfumed crowd like dry autumn leaves being pushed by a cold wind. I had not been seen in this exclusive social circle in 10 long years. The absolute last narrative they had been forcefully fed by Margaret was that I was a destitute, violent criminal who had selfishly drained my own college fund to fuel a drug habit before vanishing into the unforgiving gutter. Margaret saw me first. The blood completely drained from her perfectly contoured and powdered face for a terrifying fraction of a second. But then, her terrifying, deeply practiced societal mask snapped violently back into place with alarming speed. She immediately let go of my father's arm, gasped loudly enough for the surrounding politicians to hear, and rushed toward me. Her arms were outstretched, her eyes wide and instantly shining with flawlessly manufactured tears. "Ethan, oh, my beautiful, prodigal son, you finally came home to us," she cried out, her voice pitched to the absolute perfect decibel to ensure every single wealthy person in a 50-foot radius could witness her boundless maternal devotion. She threw her arms around my neck, pulling me into a tight, suffocating embrace that smelled heavily of incredibly expensive jasmine perfume and sheer, unadulterated panic. As she pulled me close, pressing her cheek against mine, her mouth was positioned right next to my ear. In that split second, the loving, heartbroken mother completely vanished, and the venomous, controlling dictator returned. "Smile for the damn cameras right now, you ungrateful little brat," she hissed viciously, her manicured fingernails digging painfully into the expensive wool of my custom jacket. "You are going to walk into the manager's private office in exactly 1 hour and sign that inheritance document without a single word of complaint. Or I swear to God I will make a few phone calls and make sure you lose your salary and never work in this state again." I did not pull away immediately. I stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from ice, and let the desperate society photographer snap his highly anticipated, lucrative photos of the grand reunion. Then, moving with deliberate, unstoppable force, I gently but firmly peeled her claw-like hands off my shoulders. I looked down at her and offered a calm, terrifyingly polite smile that did not reach my eyes. "Hello, Mother," I said aloud, my voice smooth, deep, and carrying perfectly across the silent onlookers who were leaning in to eavesdrop. "You look remarkably well put together for someone whose entire financial empire is currently burning to the ground." Her eyes widened in absolute, genuine shock. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Before she could formulate a toxic response, my father stepped up behind her. Richard extended a large, heavy hand, his face flushed with the expensive scotch and the absolute, arrogant certainty that he was the smartest, most powerful man in the room. "Ethan, good of you to finally show up, put your past mistakes behind you, and do the right thing for this family," he boomed aggressively, trying to instantly assert his dominance over the situation. I looked down at his outstretched hand. I did not take it. I did not move a single muscle. I just looked at him, letting the heavy, agonizing silence stretch until it became incredibly uncomfortable for every single person watching the interaction. Richard slowly lowered his hand, his jaw tightening in suppressed, explosive fury. "Let's not pretend for a single second that this is about family, Richard," I said softly, purposely using his first name for the very first time in my entire life. The sheer disrespect was highly calculated, and it hit his massive ego like a physical blow to the chest. Before he could erupt and cause a scene, Sarah, my mother's notoriously toxic best friend and the neighborhood's chief gossip architect, materialized from the dense crowd. She was holding a massive martini and looking me up and down with barely concealed disdain, completely missing the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. "Well, look who finally decided to crawl out of the woodwork," Sarah sneered loudly, a nasty, superior smile playing on her heavily glossed lips. "I see you managed to rent a very nice suit for the evening, Ethan." Did you finally get clean? Your poor, devoted mother has been completely beside herself with grief for a decade while you were off ruining your life. I slowly turned my full attention to Sarah. I had spent the last 10 years building an impenetrable skin, successfully navigating the most ruthless, cutthroat commercial real estate negotiations in the entire country. This petty woman's suburban venom was absolutely nothing but pathetic child's play to me now. Sarah, I said, my voice dripping with polite, razor-sharp condescension. It is truly fascinating to see you standing here in a country club preaching to me about moral high grounds and family values. Tell me, how exactly did that incredibly messy custody battle end up? I heard from a very reliable source that the judge presiding over your divorce was not particularly thrilled when he reviewed the subpoenaed bank statements detailing your little weekend trips to Vegas with your 25-year-old personal trainer. It is absolutely amazing what becomes public record when you have an excellent lawyer who knows exactly where to look. Sarah gasped loudly, her face instantly turning an incredibly ugly, mottled shade of crimson. Her hand shook so violently that she spilled a large drop of her expensive martini directly onto her designer silk dress. She practically scurried backward into the crowd, completely humiliated and terrified of what else I might reveal. My mother looked at me as if a terrifying stranger had just possessed her son's body. I was no longer the quiet, terrified 18-year-old boy they could easily bully, manipulate, and force into submission. I was a highly trained predator who had just purposefully walked into a gilded cage full of very plump, very clueless prey. From across the massive room, standing near the melting swan ice sculpture, I saw Julian, the golden child. He was leaning casually against a marble pillar, watching the entire brutal exchange unfold. He didn't look smug. He didn't look proud or arrogant. For the first time in his life, he just looked incredibly exhausted by the charade. When our eyes finally met across the sea of wealthy guests, he gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod of absolute solidarity. He had successfully set the stage, and now it was entirely my show to direct. I tightened my grip on the thick leather handle of my briefcase and walked deeper into the ballroom, mingling effortlessly with the elite, waiting patiently for the ultimate trap to spring. The lavish 5-course dinner service that followed was an absolute masterclass in suffocating, unbearable tension. I was seated at the main head table directly between my seething, terrified parents. I casually picked at a plate of perfectly cooked filet mignon while they desperately tried to maintain their radiant, flawless smiles for the surrounding political dignitaries. Mayor Henderson sat directly across the table from me, casually swirling a glass of red wine. He was currently in the final stages of reviewing a massive commercial real estate zoning permit for my firm, though he hadn't yet realized the connection between the wealthy developer he was reading about and the supposedly disgraced son sitting across from him. "So, Ethan," Mayor Henderson boomed cheerfully over the elegant clinking of expensive silverware, "your father tells me you've been slowly finding your way in the city, working some odd jobs, trying to get back on your feet after a rough patch." I slowly wiped my mouth with a crisp linen napkin, placed it neatly on the table, and offered a perfectly calm smile. "Actually, Mayor Henderson, that is not quite accurate. I am the senior partner directing the massive downtown waterfront acquisition. The very same billion-dollar acquisition your esteemed office is currently reviewing for the expedited commercial zoning permits." The mayor completely stopped chewing. His heavy silver fork slowly lowered back to his expensive porcelain plate. He looked sharply at my father, who was suddenly coughing violently and uncontrollably into his napkin, and then looked back at me, his eyes wide with a sudden, profound respect mixed with deep professional confusion. You are Ethan Vance? The lead developer on the waterfront revitalization project? The firm backing the new stadium? I am, I confirmed smoothly, taking a slow sip of my water. It seems my father's understanding of my current career trajectory and my salary is somewhat significantly outdated. But we are all here tonight to celebrate family and honesty, aren't we? The sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from my parents was a tangible force in the air. They were rapidly, terrifyingly losing complete control of the narrative they had spent 10 years building, and they knew it. As the dessert plates were efficiently cleared away by the waitstaff, the frantic PR coordinator practically waved her clipboard at my father from the sidelines. It was finally time. The moment of truth. Richard stood up slowly, picking up a silver spoon and tapping it repeatedly against his crystal champagne flute. The clear, sharp ringing sound cut through the ambient noise of the crowded ballroom, and a respectful hush immediately fell over the hundreds of wealthy guests. The venue's spotlight swung over, illuminating my father in a pool of bright, unforgiving white light. He cleared his throat loudly, nervously adjusting his expensive silk tie, visibly preparing to deliver the emotional performance of his lifetime to secure his financial salvation. Friends, beloved family, esteemed guests, Richard began, his deep voice echoing powerfully through the state-of-the-art sound system. Margaret and I brought you all here tonight to celebrate 30 years of marriage. 30 years of profound love, of building a lasting legacy, and of weathering the terrible storms that life inevitably throws at us. He paused dramatically, looking down at his prepared notes. We have always firmly believed that the absolute foundation of a truly successful life is family. And as many of you in this room know, our family has carried a very heavy, agonizing burden for the last 10 years. Right on cue, my mother elegantly dabbed her perfectly dry eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief, playing the role of the tragic, long-suffering matriarch to absolute, sickening perfection. Our eldest son, Ethan, unfortunately lost his way, Richard continued, his voice trembling with expertly manufactured sorrow. He struggled deeply with demons we could not fight for him. He made terrible, destructive choices. He broke our hearts and selfishly walked away from the endless love, the support, and the massive college fund we had carefully prepared for him. We spent countless, sleepless nights praying for his safe return. Recently, the tragic funeral of my late father reminded us that time is short. And tonight, I am overwhelmingly proud to announce to all of you that the incredible power of unconditional love has finally prevailed. Ethan has come home to us. The country club crowd erupted into polite, deeply moved applause. Several women actually wiped tears from their eyes. The PR coordinator practically shoved my shoulder from behind. This was my grand cue. This was the exact moment I was supposed to walk submissively up to the microphone, shed a pathetic tear, embrace the monster who raised me, and legally secure their complete financial salvation. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. I reached down and picked up the heavy black leather briefcase from the floor. I did not walk up the center aisle with my head bowed in shame. I walked with the deliberate, heavy, unstoppable strides of a seasoned executioner walking toward the gallows. I stepped up onto the elevated stage, standing completely face to face with the man who had treated my entire existence like a massive burden. I did not hug him. I simply reached out and took the microphone directly from his hand. His thick fingers gripped it tightly for a second, a silent, desperate threat, but I yanked it away with a sharp, violent motion that made the massive speakers let out a brief, piercing screech of audio feedback. The polite applause died instantly. The ballroom became so incredibly quiet you could distinctly hear the heavy rain lashing against the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Thank you, Richard, for that incredibly moving piece of absolute, unadulterated fiction, I said calmly, my voice echoing like rolling thunder in the silent, expectant room. A collective, genuinely shocked gasp swept through the wealthy crowd. My mother jumped to her feet so fast she knocked her chair backward, her face completely pale with absolute terror. Ethan, stop this right now. Someone help him. He is confused. He is having a terrible mental episode. She shrieked desperately, trying frantically to salvage the crumbling narrative. I have never been thinking more clearly in my entire life, Margaret. I fired back instantly, my cold eyes locking onto hers, pinning her completely in place. I turned my full attention to the hundreds of powerful faces staring up at me in shock. My father just stood here and told you all that I lost my way. He told you I made terrible choices and drained my own college fund. He told you I was a violent drug addict. Allow me to tell you the actual, undeniable truth. I set the heavy leather briefcase onto the polished lid of the grand piano next to the podium and snapped the golden locks open. The sharp clicking sound was as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. I did not leave this family because I was troubled or addicted to anything, I announced loudly, pulling out the first massive stack of heavily notarized, highlighted legal documents. I left because exactly 10 years ago, on my 18th birthday, my loving parents threw a lavish surprise party for my 16-year-old brother, bought him a brand new luxury Porsche, and handed me a half-eaten grocery store cake with a cheap card that explicitly told me to be more like him. I left this house with exactly $40 in my pocket to escape a lifetime of severe emotional abuse and neglect. I walked directly to the edge of the stage and handed the thick stack of papers directly down to Mayor Henderson and the 2 district court judges sitting completely stunned at the VIP table. But, as we all know, emotional abuse is not a crime in this country. I continued, my voice rising in raw power and undeniable intensity. What is a federal crime is exactly what you are holding in your hands right now, Your Honor. Those are certified financial records, official police reports, and sworn bank affidavits. They conclusively, legally prove that exactly 1 week before my 18th birthday, my loving parents completely stole my social security number, forged my signature on legal documents, and fraudulently took out a massive auto loan to buy that very Porsche. They purposely saddled a minor with $150,000 in toxic debt, purposely defaulted on it the second I ran away, and completely destroyed my financial life before it even started. The ballroom completely erupted into chaotic, horrified murmurs. Judge Miller quickly put on his reading glasses, rapidly scanning the highlighted financial documents, his jaw literally dropping open in shock. He looked up at Richard with a look of absolute professional disgust. Richard was physically shaking, his face a mottled, terrifying shade of dark purple. He aggressively lunged toward the microphone to stop me, but I easily sidestepped his clumsy grab, keeping the heavy metal stand firmly in my powerful grip. But that is not the real reason they invited you all here tonight to witness this circus, I said, projecting my voice powerfully over the rising, chaotic noise of the crowd. They didn't throw this extravagant party for a wedding anniversary. They threw it because my grandfather passed away, leaving a massive inheritance trust fund that legally requires my physical signature to be released from probate court. They desperately, pathetically need that cash. Why? Because they are completely, hopelessly broke. Shut up. Shut your mouth right now. You ungrateful bastard. Margaret screamed at the top of her lungs, completely losing her refined, aristocratic country club composure, sounding exactly like a feral, trapped animal. They are completely broke, I repeated firmly, pulling the final, most devastating legal document from the briefcase. They have entirely mismanaged their logistics business into the ground. They took out a massive, high-interest second mortgage on this beautiful, sprawling suburban estate just to keep paying their expensive country club dues, and they completely defaulted on that loan, too. The lending bank legally classified their mortgage as highly toxic debt. I held the thick, watermarked property deed high in the air, ensuring the bright stage spotlight hit it directly so everyone could see the official seals. They honestly thought if they paid people to get me fired from my job, and by the way, my ex-girlfriend and my former colleague have both officially confessed in writing to the corporate espionage you entirely funded, Margaret, and my ruthless lawyers are currently drafting the massive civil lawsuit. They thought if they destroyed my entire life, I would come crawling back here to sign their inheritance papers to save their precious house. I turned slowly, deliberately, facing my trembling parents directly, letting them clearly see the absolute, icy void of mercy in my eyes. But here is the final, beautiful twist, Richard. You don't need the inheritance money to save your house anymore, because the private lending firm decided to sell your toxic debt. They sold it for cash to a blind corporate LLC. I leaned incredibly close to the microphone, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet whisper that still somehow carried to the very back of the massive room. I own that LLC. I bought your debt. I legally own the deed to the estate. I own your entire house. And as of 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, you are officially being evicted from my property. The profound, heavy silence that immediately followed that final revelation was, Without a single doubt, the most incredibly beautiful, satisfying sound I had ever experienced in my entire 28 years on this earth. It was the crushing, suffocating silence of absolute, irreversible destruction. The carefully constructed, fiercely protected, 30-year-old facade of the perfect, wealthy, morally superior suburban family did not just simply crack. It completely pulverized into fine dust right in front of the most powerful, influential people in the entire city. Mayor Henderson was the very first person to physically react. He stood up so abruptly that his heavy wooden chair scraped loudly and harshly against the polished hardwood floor. He dropped the incredibly damning identity theft documents and bank affidavits back onto the linen tablecloth as if they were physically radioactive and burning his fingers. He didn't say a single word to my father. He didn't offer a polite excuse. He just quickly buttoned his tailored suit jacket, signaled frantically to his bewildered wife, and walked straight toward the main exit with an expression of pure horror. When the mayor moved, the massive dam completely broke. The two district judges followed his lead immediately, casting looks of profound professional disdain and personal disgust at Richard as they hurried away from the VIP table. Within seconds, the entire grand ballroom was in a state of chaotic, panicked motion. Elite high society is incredibly, notoriously fickle. They will gladly drink your expensive vintage champagne and eat your imported caviar for decades as long as your social reputation is perfectly pristine. But the absolute second you are publicly exposed as a fraudulent, broke, desperate criminal, they will abandon you much faster than rats fleeing a rapidly sinking ship. Absolutely nobody in that room wanted their respectable names anywhere near an impending, massive federal identity theft lawsuit, a corporate espionage scandal, and a deeply humiliating public residential eviction. Wait, everyone, please stop, you have to listen to me. This is a massive misunderstanding. He is lying. He is a psychotic, vengeful liar. Margaret shrieked at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking horribly, completely destroying her carefully cultivated, refined accent. She lunged off the stage, her high heels slipping slightly on the polished wood, trying desperately to grab the arm of a wealthy real estate developer she had known for 20 years. But the man literally recoiled from her frantic touch, shaking his head in absolute disgust and hurrying toward the busy coat check line. Richard was completely, physically paralyzed on the stage. The arrogant, booming, terrifying patriarch who had ruled my childhood with an iron fist was completely gone. In his place stood a hollow, shaking, incredibly old man whose entire fabricated universe had just violently collapsed onto his drooping shoulders. He looked out at the rapidly emptying ballroom, watching his precious social standing, his entire identity, evaporate into the cold, stormy night. Then, slowly, painfully, he turned his head to look directly at me. The raw hatred burning in his eyes was palpable, but it was completely and utterly overshadowed by pure, unadulterated, primal terror. He finally realized, perhaps for the very first time in his entire life, that he had absolutely zero leverage. I held all the cards. I owned the entire board. "Ethan?" Richard rasped, his voice sounding incredibly weak, like dry sandpaper scraping against wood. "Ethan, please. We are your family. You can't possibly do this to us. We will lose absolutely everything we have built. The country club memberships, the logistics business, all of our friends. We will be completely ruined." "You completely ruined yourselves, Richard," I replied coldly, without a single ounce of pity, meticulously packing the heavy legal documents back into my leather briefcase and snapping the golden locks shut with a sharp click. "I just finalized the required legal paperwork. You happily sacrificed my entire future and my credit just to buy a sports car. You actively tried to destroy my hard-earned career to steal a grandfather's inheritance. You are not my family. You are just terrible, toxic financial investments that I am finally, aggressively liquidating." Suddenly, Julian stepped up onto the stage from the shadows. He had been completely quiet the entire night, watching the brutal carnage unfold from his position near the ice sculpture. Margaret saw him approaching and instantly burst into fresh, loud, desperate tears of relief. Julian, honey, thank God. Do something. Tell these people your brother is crazy. Help us fix this." Julian stopped and looked down at his mother, the woman who had worshipped the very ground he walked on, who had handed him the entire world on a silver platter while actively starving me of basic affection. He looked at the empty ballroom, the discarded linen napkins, the half-eaten expensive food left on the tables. Then he looked directly at me. "I'm not helping you anymore, Mom," Julian said loudly, his voice surprisingly steady and clear, though I could see his hands were trembling slightly at his sides. "Ethan is telling the absolute truth. You completely forced me to lie for you for 10 years. You bought me that stupid car, and when I finally found out how you actually paid for it, you aggressively threatened to cut me off financially if I ever told him the truth. I absolutely hated that car. I hate this fake life. I hate the terrible person you forced me to become just so you could show off to your snobby country club friends." Margaret let out a gut-wrenching, theatrical wail, collapsing entirely to her knees right there on the wooden stage, burying her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably. The golden child, her ultimate prize and justification for all her cruelty, had just publicly and definitively rejected her. It was the final, most devastating emotional blow. Richard took a sudden, aggressive step toward Julian, instinctively raising his heavy hand, his face violently twisted in uncontrolled rage. "You ungrateful little—" Before Richard could even finish the sentence or swing his arm, I stepped directly between them, dropping my briefcase instantly and getting right in his face. I was significantly taller than him now, much broader in the shoulders, and completely fueled by 10 years of brutal survival. "Do not even think about it," I growled, my voice vibrating with a terrifying, absolute promise of immediate physical violence. "If you ever raise a hand to him or to anyone else ever again, the financial ruin and the eviction will be the absolute least of your incredibly massive problems. Do you understand me clearly?" Richard completely froze, his raised hand trembling pathetically in the air. He looked deep into my eyes and saw that I was absolutely, unequivocally not bluffing. Slowly, pathetically, he lowered his hand and backed away. His shoulders slumped in total, irreversible defeat. I picked up my briefcase from the floor. I didn't look at my mother crying hysterically on the stage. I didn't look at my broken, pathetic father. I gave Julian a single, firm nod, silently acknowledging that he had finally, bravely done the right thing, and I walked purposefully down the steps of the stage. I walked out of the grand ballroom, out of the opulent, quiet foyer, and out into the cool, stormy night. The heavy rain had finally stopped, leaving the night air smelling incredibly clean and completely fresh. I handed my ticket to the stunned valet, got into the back of my waiting town car, and told the driver to go. I drove away, leaving the completely burning ruins of their pathetic, fake empire far behind me in the rearview mirror. The ensuing weeks following the country club disaster were a massive whirlwind of absolute, merciless legal precision and execution. I did not falter for a single second, and my legal team did not grant any extensions or show any mercy. True to my explicit word on that stage, at exactly 9 a.m. the very morning after the catastrophic anniversary party, my team of highly aggressive corporate lawyers and local sheriffs served my parents with formal, ironclad eviction notices at the front door of the estate. They were legally forced to frantically pack up 30 years of accumulated luxury, their expensive art collections, their designer clothes, and completely vacate the sprawling, multi-million-dollar suburban estate within 30 days. Because the incredibly juicy society gossip had spread like absolute wildfire following the public country club meltdown, they quickly found themselves completely, devastatingly socially isolated. Absolutely no one answered their frantic, begging phone calls. The major banks, immediately alerted to the impending federal identity theft lawsuits and the severe, undeniable financial instability, instantly froze all of their remaining credit lines and business accounts. Because of their ruined credit, they couldn't even secure a basic loan for a small new house. They ended up desperately renting a cramped, incredibly dingy two-bedroom apartment on the loud, heavily industrial side of the city. Ironically, just a few short blocks away from the very same roach-infested building I had lived in when I first ran away at 18. The absolute poetic justice of the situation was almost overwhelming to witness from afar. As for my grandfather's massive inheritance trust fund, it remained permanently and securely locked in probate court. I formally and legally refused to sign the necessary release documents. I simply didn't need the money, my salary was more than enough, and I was absolutely determined to ensure they never, ever saw a single red cent of it. The trust would likely sit there untouched for decades, a massive pile of unreachable cash completely taunting them for the rest of their miserable, broke lives. Furthermore, my relentless lawyers officially initiated a massive, crushing civil lawsuit against Derek, Chloe, and my parents for the corporate espionage and the deliberate malicious sabotage of my career. The sheer, terrifying threat of the impending astronomical legal fees forced Richard to officially and publicly file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The last update I heard from Aunt Clara was that the immense, crushing stress of losing their wealth, their home, and their precious status had caused Margaret and Richard to turn viciously on each other, and they were currently navigating an incredibly bitter, incredibly nasty, highly publicized divorce. A few months later, the dust from the explosion had finally, completely settled. I was sitting comfortably in my expansive new corner office, looking out through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling, beautiful city skyline. My name was newly and proudly painted on the heavy glass door, Ethan Vance, Senior Partner. I had officially, successfully closed the massive waterfront real estate deal, securing my absolute financial independence and cementing a professional legacy that I had built with my own two hands, entirely from scratch, without a single favor from anyone. The sleek intercom on my polished mahogany desk buzzed gently. My assistant's professional voice came through the speaker. "Mr. Vance? Your brother is here in the lobby to see you." I pressed the button firmly. "Send him in." Julian walked slowly into the massive office. He looked drastically, fundamentally different. The arrogant, perfectly styled, entitled golden boy of the suburbs was completely gone. He was wearing a simple, inexpensive button-down shirt and slightly faded, normal jeans. He looked incredibly tired, but for the very first time in his entire life, he looked completely genuine and unburdened. He walked quietly over to my desk, reached deep into his pocket, and pulled something out. He placed a shiny set of keys featuring a distinct, expensive crest quietly onto the polished wood. The keys to the Porsche. "I legally sold it back to the luxury dealership yesterday," Julian said softly, his voice echoing slightly in the large, quiet room. "I used the cash to officially pay off the massive remaining balance on the auto loan they originally, fraudulently put in your name. I know the bad debt was already cleared from your credit report years ago, but the bank still held the financial loss on their books. It's officially paid in full now. Every single cent is covered. The car is permanently gone." I looked down at the keys resting on the desk, then looked up at my younger brother. It was a massive, incredibly significant gesture of actual accountability. He had willingly given up his ultimate status symbol, the very thing that triggered my departure, to finally right a terrifying wrong he hadn't even fully understood when it originally happened. "Thank you, Julian," I said sincerely, leaning back in my chair. "What are you going to do now?" He shrugged, a small, genuine, almost hopeful smile touching his lips. "I got a real job, entry-level sales at a small logistics tech company. I'm renting a tiny studio apartment downtown. It's incredibly hard work, and I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing most of the time, but I don't know. I finally feel like I can actually breathe without someone monitoring me. I don't have to constantly perform for them anymore. I don't have to be the perfect son. You never had to be," I told him quietly, meaning every word. "They just manipulated you into believing you did to serve their own egos." We sat there and talked for over an hour. It wasn't entirely perfect, and the massive, gaping psychological wounds of our deeply toxic, divided childhood weren't magically healed in a single afternoon conversation. But for the very first time in our lives, we were actually talking as two independent, equal men, not playing the assigned roles of the golden child and the scapegoat. We agreed to grab dinner the following week. It was a small, fragile step, but it was a definitive step forward. Later that evening, after the sun had set, I left the towering glass office building and drove my car to a small, incredibly quiet suburban neighborhood. I walked up the pathway and knocked on a familiar, comforting wooden door. Aunt Clara opened it almost immediately, her face lighting up with a massive, incredibly warm smile. She pulled me into a fierce, genuine hug that smelled comfortably of cinnamon, old books, and actual, unconditional love. We sat together at her small, cozy kitchen table. She reached into the refrigerator and carefully pulled out a small, perfectly decorated, whole chocolate cake. There was a single, brightly burning candle placed exactly in the center. "Happy belated birthday, Ethan," she said softly, her eyes shining with proud, genuine tears. 10 years late, but you finally made it." I looked at the cake. It wasn't half-eaten. It wasn't a cruel afterthought. It was absolutely perfect. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and made a silent, unbreakable vow to myself to never, ever let anyone compromise my absolute worth or dictate my reality ever again. I blew out the candle. The thin wisp of smoke drifted slowly up toward the ceiling, carrying away the very last lingering ghosts of my deeply painful past. I didn't win by aggressively, illegally destroying them. I won by firmly refusing to be destroyed by them. I won by stepping completely, bravely out of the suffocating, toxic, fake spotlight they had trapped me in, and fiercely building my own damn stage. And let me tell you, the view from up here is absolutely spectacular. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a hard, incredibly painful line in the sand to protect your own future? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.